program. Her talk is called Final FSMA Pre-Harvest Agricultural Water Rule for Produce Farms.
Hello, hello. Thank you all for showing up. My name is Karen, as was introduced, and I'm here to talk to you about new water rule regulations that came out this past May. So I want to start out by saying that this is relevant for anyone in the room that deals with fresh produce, including not just raspberries as advertised here, blueberries, strawberries. That's all going to apply with this regulation. So if you're a potato grower, this would be relevant, but not directly relevant. So I just wanted to caveat that to start. So I'll be presenting on the new rule updates, and I'm also going to be inviting my coworker Evan to jump in and give you guys a little bit of experience and insight into how he's seeing this played out in the field. So I'm going to start out by giving you guys a little bit of context about our program and what we do so that you guys have a sense of how this all gets played out. Then I'm going to dive into the new content. Again, there was a new final rule on pre-harvest ag water that came out in May. So I'm going to do a deep dive into all of those new requirements. Then Evan will talk about inspection observations he's seeing in the field. And then we'll end with resources, places you can go to get more information. There's lots of information out there, research to help support you in this decision-making process about how to manage risk on your farm, particularly as it relates to water. So a little context. This is our small but mighty team in Washington State. We are the program who is funded by FDA to actually do both the education about the water rule and other aspects of the FSMA produce safety rule. And we also have an inspection arm. So we've got Evan, Jared, Thane, Erica, who are all our boots on the ground, going out to you guys in different parts of the state to go out and ensure that you're doing what you say you're doing as it pertains to the rule. We've also got some great administrative staff that are doing a lot of things behind the scenes to make that process smooth for you guys. We have Leah, who is our administrative coordinator. Leah's actually here today. Wave her hand. Be nice to Leah. She's the one calling you guys to try to schedule your inspections. We really do try to accommodate your schedules and make it as easy as possible and not try to take too much of your time because I know you're busy and that these have to occur during harvest, just like your gap audits. So we try to be as accommodating as possible, knowing that those times a year are really stressful and intense and there's a lot going on. We've also got Bradley Geist, who's another administrative person who helps us in the background as well with tracking all the different Washington farms in the state, because we have to determine, are you a large enough farm to such that the rule is applies to you, or do you have other exemptions? And he helps us work through that on a case-by-case basis. And then of course we have our program manager, Connie Fisk, who has been working in this field for a really long time. We're fortunate to have her. She's come from an educational background, training, and she brings a lot of knowledge to this as well, which is a great asset for Washington State in general, because we also see our role as advocates for farms. We do try to listen and learn to understand climate impacts, other market challenges, and we do feed those things up to FDA and other contacts to say, hey, this is how the rule is really looking in its implementation on the ground. Let's make sure that this isn't overly burdensome for you guys. Here's a little snippet of our farms in the state that are required to comply with this rule. From our records, that's just a little bit over 1,000. And since 2019, we've done 657 inspections just with that small team of 2 to 4 over the last several years. So we do a lot of work getting out to farms, Our inspections typically last about 2 hours, a lot shorter than FDA's longer half-day, multi-day inspection. So again, we are trying to make that as streamlined as possible for everyone involved. For a little bit of a breakdown on the types of crops that we're seeing that are covered, some growers may fall into more than one of these categories. That's why these numbers wouldn't add up to the total covered farms. But just to give you a sense, the majority of our farms that we are inspecting are from the tree fruit industry, because a lot of those farms are covered because they're selling through distributors. Same thing would apply for our berry growers as well. So if you're over $500,000 in annual average produce sales, more than likely you're covered by the rule, particularly if you are selling through a distributor or processor. There's a chance you may have an exemption if all of your produce were to go through a commercial processing step, whether it's a heat treated aspect. You would need to have documentation to support that, but there may be some wiggle room for an exemption. So if you think that may apply to you, feel free to reach out to us individually after this. We've got a table. Please come chat with us. We'd be happy to work through that with you. And then we've got other crops that are here. We've got our diversified farms that are doing a variety of different vegetable crops. Onions are another big producer for us as well. So that's just a little bit of the landscape of what we do. But into the meat of things. So agricultural water, I need to start out with a definition just to get us all on the same page. This is definition right from the rule that FDA has put together. So from their perspective, agricultural water means water used in covered activities. Covered activities are growing, harvesting, packing, or holding produce. Okay. So if you're doing any one of those things, you are doing a covered activity. On covered produce, so we talked about how all those crops that we just listed are covered produce. Produce that wouldn't be covered would be, for example, potatoes, because those are typically processed, heat treated before consumption. So that is a rarely consumed raw product. So your berries are going to be covered produce. Where water is intended to or likely to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. So keep that in mind. Ask yourselves, do I use agricultural water on my property? For example, am I irrigating my crops in a way that is actually contacting the harvestable portion of the crop? That is important to emphasize because that affects all of whether this applies to you or not in your operation. And don't forget about those food contact surfaces as well. So that's harvest bins. Our hands ourselves are essentially a food contact surface as well. Equipment. So if we're using a mechanical harvester, that would be a food contact surface, right? So more than likely you're using some sort of agricultural water on your property. But here is an exemption or example of a potential exemption from that. So say you were growing blueberries and you were irrigating with drip irrigation in a way that the water was not coming in contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. In that case, that water would not need to follow the agricultural water rule requirements that I'm about to outline. However, if there's any reason to believe that the sprayer may be broken or is intended to contact the harvestable portion, we want to kind of rethink that. In any case, we want to be taking a risk-based approach to looking at our water quality. So if you were taking a different approach, say the drip line irrigation is running through the middle of the bush, then I would think that may move into agricultural water because the likelihood of it contacting the berry is much more likely. So there's always a range here of what the level of risk is. So again, another contextual piece, why do we put so much emphasis on this? Why have why has it taken many, many years to come to a new final rule on this? Well, there's a couple of variables that come into play. The new final rule does expect growers to be taking this big holistic contextual thinking. So it's important that we talk through these big concepts. Okay. So this is important because water has many uses on the farm, right? We're not just irrigating. We are cleaning and sanitizing harvest bins. We're washing our hands. We are maybe, if we have animals, there's ponds for our farm animals to be drinking from. All of these pieces need to be taken in context. You may have many different water sources on your property as well. Do you use both a municipal source and also irrigate from a pond or from a river or from an irrigation district? As a grower, you need to have a sense of what those different sources are and what the quality of those different sources are. Because water is used in so many different applications on the farm, that creates also more opportunity for human pathogen introduction. And that's coming from places like ourselves. We carry pathogens just naturally, bacteria, viruses on our hands, on our bodies, on our clothing. We also have pathogen introduction from animals, wild animals, farm animals. Pathogens can be carried airborne as well, but through water is another big piece because it spreads those pathogens so easily because of its just fluid nature. Its ability to, if you've got bird poop on one berry, and then you were to irrigate, it's easier to spread, right, that pathogen from one berry to another. So water is a big player in the movement of pathogens on the farm. To emphasize this about the water sources and how there might be multiple, this is actually data we have from our program showing all the different types of water sources. Knowing your type of water source gives you some indication of level of risk. Typically, we think of surface water as having higher risk because of its exposure to the environment, right? Animals, human recreational activities. Are there, during the summer, families that swim in the river upstream from you? Are they tubing? Do you have a neighbor that likes to take their horses through the dry riverbed on the off season? These are things that the rule is asking you to consider to the extent that it is under your control. In general, we tend to think of surface water as higher risk. Not to say you can't use it. It just needs to be taken into consideration. Groundwater, the water that moves under the surface of the ground, generally, has some more level of protection, and it's having some natural infiltration and filtration by moving through the sediment of the ground. So generally a little bit more protected. And then our municipal or public water sources tend to be considered less risk because they're usually treated prior to coming to you. And there's other standards, county standards, state standards requiring those sources to be testing those water to a particular standard. So if you can provide evidence of that, then you have better assurance that your water is less risky. So this is showing that a large majority of our farms in Washington state that are growing produce, they're doing harvesting, are primarily using that higher risk. That's okay. We just want to take that into consideration. And some are using multiple sources for that growing activity, or they might have more than one available to them, which is a benefit. If you were to know there was a concern with your surface water, you might have an alternative as a way to irrigate. So that can be to your benefit as a risk management agent. So, and then few farms have all three sources. That's only at 3%. Okay. So what does the rule say about water and water quality? We defined what water is. Now, what is the expectation? And here is the real blanket legalese statement that FDA provides to us on this topic, which says all agricultural water must be of safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. Clear as mud, right? We don't know. So what does that mean? There's lots of questions that come up around this. That's why this rule has been in development for over 10 years to try to get at how do we put a standard on this that all farms in the country can comply with and abide with, and that is reasonable and not overly burdensome from an operational standpoint. We're going to dive into what the rule is saying now about that. So, but key point, sanitary quality for its intended use. I'm going to talk about the types of water. So what FDA does is splits water into two parts. Maybe you can guess what those are. The first type of water use is your pre-harvest water. Any water that you're using prior to harvest. So that's going to be irrigation water. Again, it needs to be contacting the harvestable portion of the crop. This could be water you're using when you're mixing pesticides and applying it in a broadcast if the harvestable portion is visible and in contact. This could be any other water that's applied during the growing season for dust abatement, for managing sunburn, anything of that nature would fall into this pre-harvest water category. This used to be called production water. So if anyone's used to be calling it that, don't be confused. Maybe y'all can guess what the other type is. The other one is post-harvest water. Post-harvest water is water that's in contact with the produce during harvest or after that harvest point. So that's water used to wash the produce, used to wash hands, used to wash equipment, whether that's harvest equipment or equipment that's used in a packing house. Any other water used in cleaning and sanitizing of packing equipment, floors, buildings, etc. These are the two categories of water, and they have different water quality standards in the rule. Before I dive into this, I want to make sure that you all know a couple things about what did not change with this new publication of the rule. What has not changed, what you should be doing now, all covered farms in the room, and continue to do, at minimum, every year, you must do an agricultural water inspection at the beginning of the growing season, but at least annually, and to do it again if there is a change in the circumstances. So what does this mean? What are you doing? You are identifying conditions reasonably likely to introduce hazards into or onto covered produce or food contact surfaces. So we're looking for those introductions of pathogens. Let's dive into that even more. Okay, so what are we actually trying to observe? We want to, during that inspection process, and this is something you're going to need to write down. I trust that you actually have a lot of this information already in your head, but when we come out, we're going to need to see that you have acknowledged this, that you have confirmed this in paper and writing. You could even write this down now. We are working through these inspections and these ag water assessments live to be thinking through what an inspector would be expecting. So first, type of water source. So surface, municipal, ground, write that down. Extent of your control over it. Do you have a pond that is pretty much all, irrigation pond that's pretty much all in your control? Or do you have a river running through that is also upstream coming past a more residential area where there might be other recreational uses or other concerns? We know that you can't totally control what's happening upstream, but the extent that you can have knowledge of that to be preventing issues or changing your strategy based on what's happening upstream, the better. Similarly, degree of protection. Some farms may be taking an extra step, for example, to maybe fence their irrigation pond to prevent their farm animals from getting into it or from prevent wild animals. We know that we can't totally control wild animal use on the property, that it's part of the ecosystem, but we need to be considering it. Similarly, use of adjacent nearby land. This has been a big thing with some of the outbreaks that have happened. Some of the causes that they've looked into a lot have been, for example, the bigger CAFOS operations that have been operating very close to a produce farm. We think that there is some transference there of pathogens, either airborne or through the water, or during severe weather events. So keeping that in mind, keeping in mind what other production uses you have on your operation. And then generally other hazards that may be introduced prior to reaching your farm. Many years back, there was a sewage leak into an irrigation canal out in Eastern Washington. That's an example of a hazard introduced prior to reaching your farm, and farms had to take that spillage into consideration about whether they could harvest their crop. That's an extreme example, right? This bullet is small, but not small relative to the number of different section items in the rule. But I can summarize it briefly for you. In general, we're expecting that you're maintaining these systems so that they're functioning properly. We want them, again, to be protected so that we don't have rodent intrusion into your surface, into your groundwater well. Of course, you wouldn't want that anyway. You'd be already doing this because you want your water distribution system to be working. You know, if you've got a broken emitter, you're going to want to fix that because you're going to be wasting water if you don't, right? Similarly, we don't want that broken emitter because we don't want pooling water where we've now got more of a stagnant water situation that could eventually breed some pathogens that can get tracked into the production field. So things like that, I bet you're already doing a good job of this. But part of your ag water inspection, you're going to go out to your field and you're going to say, hey, is everything working? Do I have no risk of rainwater getting into my groundwater source because my well cap is fully encapsulated? And I had my, and if I didn't have knowledge about that, I've brought out someone who is an expert in the well system to confirm that everything is working properly. That would be part of what you put in your general ag water inspection. So this is going to apply to both pre-harvest water and your post-harvest water. So this is something that did not change with this new water rule coming out. You are expected to be doing this every year and continue to do this from year to year. What also has not changed with this new rule coming out is the water quality expectations for post-harvest water. Post-harvest water. Again, that's for cleaning hands, sanitizing. Covered farms must do the following: confirm that they're using a no detectable generic E. coli water source for those activities, because this is the water that's coming in contact with the produce, coming in contact with hands and things very close to when we're going to be consuming that product, right? So we want to be using clean water. Clean water defined by FDA is having a test result of no detectable generic E. coli. So if you're using a groundwater source for that, you would initially test that water 4 times in that season. If you continue to get a negative result or no presence of generic E. coli, sometimes that's what the test lab will provide you with, then from year to year, you can just test it once a year to reconfirm that. If you had any reason to believe that there's an issue with the distribution of that water, you could always test more, but I'm giving the minimum standard expectation that we're looking for per the rule. Now, if you're using a municipal water source, you would not be required to test it so long as you could get documentation from your city that a certificate that ensures that they're able to verify a no detectable generic E. coli water quality. You may not use your irrigation water for washing the produce after it's harvested or cleaning and sanitizing tools and equipment. Most growers were already following a lot of this prior to even this rule coming out. So it's just a reassurance that this is the continued requirement. You're also still expected to monitor your recycling water. So we're thinking mostly berries. So maybe the berries, maybe you're not washing them. Maybe the packing house is dealing with some of that, depending on whether they're washing them at all. But say for our apple growers, they need to confirm if they're washing that produce that the recycled water, that bath tank water is not building up with organic material, and that you're periodically changing that water. It wouldn't be the same water from day to day to day, right? You've got to have a change schedule for that. We would also be expecting that you're thinking about the temperature of the water relative to the temperature of the product. When there's a differential in that, something can be caused, which is called an infiltration, where the water gets sucked into the product, which can suck in pathogens as well. If you're interested in that topic, I'm happy to chat with you separately on that. Okay, so all of that is the existing content. And now I want to talk to you about what has changed in the rule. How many people have already been through a Produce Safety Alliance grower training or learned about FSMA before? Okay, so all of that stuff before shouldn't have been new. Sorry to repeat it, but I gotta hone in on what is still true. What has changed are the pre-harvest ag water rule requirements. Originally, if you guys remember, if you guys went through the training, there was like 20 tests required for surface water over a period of time. With the new water rule, there is not a direct testing requirement for your ag water. Instead, you're going to have to first do an ag water assessment. This is going to be a holistic approach to look at all those things I've already been mentioning about environmental factors. You can still test if you're already testing, say, for your GAP requirements to support any of your decision-making processes, but testing doesn't exempt you out of this ag water assessment. In general, this is the high-level stuff, right? What the new rule is doing is expecting each grower to basically understand their water quality and be able to explain how they manage their water system and what they do to minimize risk. So that's like the overarching thing that when we're out there, you're going to have to be able to explain. And all of our education up to this point is hopefully going to make you feel vested to be able to answer those questions. And then, of course, there's going to be some renumbering of the rule and the requirements. So that all has gotten updated. We have new, we call them pocket guides. Our inspectors love them because it details the actual rules. I know it's dry, but we have those codified language of the rule that you can actually read what FDA has written about each of these sections. That could be informative because that's, if we were to make an observation while we're out on site, we'd have to be able to cite the rule specifically. So it can be used as a defensible measure. And it's a way to speak our language on the regulator side. Okay. So what is an agricultural water assessment? This is separate from the inspection, but again, is similar in that it must be conducted at the beginning of the growing season, but at least annually. It is only focused on the pre-harvest ag water, okay? And there are 5 elements of this that you want to be considering. These are more elements than they outlined in the initial rule, so I'm going to walk you through them. The first is your agricultural water system. Again, so knowing your water source, where it comes from, how it's distributed on the property, what kind of piping might you have, what kind of backflow devices maybe do you have to prevent siphoning issues or protection from surface water getting into a groundwater source, for example. Again, how much is it protected from other environmental intrusions? That's one piece. The second is, okay, how do you use it, right? What is the intended use for that particular source? So each source you're gonna need to look at separately, your ground source, your surface water source. If you have more than one field and they're like separated by different distances and they're even across different county lines, you're gonna wanna think about those different water sources as well, because they're not all one the same. the application method is going to be a big play a big role in terms of the risk. Is it coming in contact with the harvest portion of the crop? Is it applied during direct, or is it overhead sprayed? Another strategy kind of for managing your risk is that time interval between direct application and harvest. So when you're irrigating close to the time of harvest, you're introducing more risk closer to the time when that product is going to be going to market and more likely to be, consumed. What's new with this rule is they added this piece about crop characteristics. So you can take that into play as well when you think about, okay, what is the water situation on my property? What am I actually growing? Some crops are going to be a little bit more susceptible to damage, right? Damaged crops are going to have more risk of pathogens coming into the inner parts of the fruit if they're damaged or they're bruised. So to what degree is your crop damaged, or what is the surface of your crop? So an apple that has a smoother surface, the water may slick off that surface a little easier than, say, a tomato or a cantaloupe that's got a lot of crevices. So these are things that you can take into consideration. Environmental conditions. So looking at the climate of and the weather conditions of your particular area. So severe weather issues, flooding, freezing, which could cause damage to a crop, right? Or has it been a really hot summer and you actually might get some pathogen reduction through the sun, UV, and radiation can also actually kill off some of the bacteria and viruses in the environment. So that can play to your advantage. So that's going to be a piece of this as well. And then any other relevant factors. So this is where they this is where they put in the water testing without directly putting in the water testing as specifically as they did in the first iteration of the rule. So if you have water tests, those can be used to say, hey, this is how I evaluate the quality of my water. We've had tests over this period of time for this many years, and it continues to show that my water is trending in this direction. So therefore, I feel comfortable following with X, Y, or Z management plan. Okay. There are a couple of ways you could have an exemption from the agricultural water assessment. There's 3 options here. One is if you're using harvest or post-harvest water quality for pre-harvest water uses. So if you're using a clean water source defined as no detectable generic E. coli for pre-harvest activities with documentation, you could have an exemption from doing that ag water assessment. Or if you're only using municipal water for pre-harvest activities, probably most farms aren't doing that because that could get expensive, right? But that could be an exemption. Or if you're treating your water per the rules, this isn't like really a full out either, right? Because if you're treating your water, there's a lot of considerations that go into mind. There's expense involved in treating your water. There's additional checkpoints that you would want to do to confirm that your treatment is working effectively. But those are some options. So you would also need to be sure that it wouldn't be reasonably likely that the water quality is affected prior to its use. So if you say it's harvest and post-harvest water quality, and then it's there's a contamination, there's an event where surface water gets into that source, it's no longer a harvest or post-harvest water quality. So you want to be sure that it's actually maintaining that quality up until the point of its use. And none of this exempts you from having documentation to confirm your exemption, right? So they're here, but they're not without strings attached. Okay. So ag water assessment, you're doing all this thinking, this holistic view. Okay, what happens once you do this assessment? What buckets do I put myself into? So there's these if-then scenarios that play out. I'm going to start with highest risk concern first. This is the red box. So if you determine the water is not safe or not of adequate sanitary quality, which again is a little bit of a nebulous statement, right? Then you must immediately discontinue the use of that water source and take corrective measures before use in pre-harvest. So I'm going to define another definition, I'm sorry, but I'm going to define to give you examples about what a corrective measure is. And so what is not safer of and not of adequate sanitary quality? The example that FDA has provided us with to this point is examples of really egregious situations. So for example, like a dead deer in the river that I can visibly see where that water is being used for my pre-harvest activities. That would be an example of a scenario that would fall into this more extreme category. The lesser extreme would be any conditions that you are concerned after you've done these observations, evaluated the situation, and there's some risk, not as egregious as what maybe I had mentioned, but I have some concern that there might be issues related to things tied to animal activity, human waste, or other animal poop, basically. Anything related to animals, we've got more of a pathogen risk than, say, a plant impact. If it falls into this category, then you would implement mitigation measures promptly and no later than the same growing season. So you're still following through with some sort of response. The expectation is that you're addressing that as soon as possible. We'd still want you to address that as soon as possible, but you have a little bit more of a runway to accomplish that. Okay, so maybe it's not related to animals or a raw compost or raw manure situation. Maybe it's related to something else, like a concern you have about a neighbor activity. So maybe it falls into this lesser category. Then you would implement mitigation measures as soon as practical and no later than the following year. Or you could do testing to confirm that it's in a reasonable threshold to continue to proceed. So again, testing is a tool that can be used, but it's not a direct requirement. Well, you could also, after all of this, determine that there are no hazards. If that's the case, then you continue to do what you're doing from year to year, and you're going to do that process, the ag water assessment, again each year. What's nice is once you get the foundation laid out for this inspection process and for the ag water assessment, you're going to hopefully get into a routine that you can use your documentation from previous years, make slight adjustments as you go on. You guys have been, for those of you who've been in this business for a while, you know what your situation, you know what your climate issues have been over the years. You know what has worked, what hasn't worked. So those are valuable experiences that you can use to support what you're doing here. We just need to see both that inspection and ag water assessment in some sort of written form so that we can verify it. Okay, so if you remember from this slide, the red talks about corrective measures and the orange and the yellow talk about mitigation measures. So the rule does kind of get into more detail about what those are. So corrective measures, this is again where you're kind of doing a stop hold on operation until you can figure it out. You're going to re-inspect, identify the issue, basic problem solving right here, cause and effect. You're going to try to identify what that is and you address it. Or if that's really not an option, another alternative for folks would be to treat the water. This is also where if you did have another water source you could use alternatively, you could stop using that one water source and use an alternative water source if that is available to you. I know that's not what everyone's situation might be. If it's in that less extreme category, there's a lot of options that they actually specifically outline for you. So making necessary changes and repairs. Maybe it's a broken emitter or broken wellhead. You can also use techniques to, again, do less irrigating close to the time of harvest because of microbial die-off, which is what I was talking about, where pathogens actually naturally, through research, we can show that the pathogens die off, in the soil over time through sun and other radiation. This isn't a silver bullet option, but it does reduce your risk. Similarly, another time interval beat harvest and end of storage. So these are just time periods. You can track those and look at, use some of the research that is out there to make reasonable decisions about when to irrigate, when to not irrigate. So what I had mentioned before, changing the application method would be another option if you're in a fortunate situation for that. Treating the water would be another option. They just came out with one product that actually is EPA registered to help in treating pre-harvest agricultural water. So more and more things are going to be coming on the market for this. So that's fortunate. And then other mitigation measures if supported by, research and science. By the way, shout out to the Produce Safety Alliance who has provided some of this content and has modules that have updated on per the new water rule. This is just a little bit more deep dive into different measures or issues that might come up. Maybe there's a manure runoff or lots of birds in an irrigation pond. So maybe what you're doing is something to deter those animals during the growing season, and then reevaluating the impacts. With anything that you're doing, you want to keep in mind, state and county federal regulations, particularly when it pertains to wild animals. And then you want to confirm, ideally, you cause and effect. You try to repair something, see if it works, and then you might want to see if that was effective. Testing could be a way of kind of verifying whether your plan worked, right? Again, treating water is another option. Keep in mind that treating water, can have some costs pertaining to it, takes its own management as well. There are different options out there, chemical and non-chemical water treatments. A basic filtration system is not going to get you really to the level that it's looking here, because that's not attacking the pathogen risk that we're looking at, the microbial pathogen risk. And also want to note any negative environmental impacts from treating water. So you want to think about the discharge from using like a chemical product, for example. If you are doing the treatment process, you'll need to have records verifying that you're doing monitoring to show that it's been effective as well. Here's a little bit more about that microbial die-off that I was mentioning. So again, doing less irrigating close to the time of harvest. Why I kept this in here is they have gotten a little bit more flexible in the rule with this new regulation coming out, that it could be both either a qualitative or a quantitative approach. If you have test records from the past, I can help you really determine what that window interval would be. But you can also just kind of take an anecdotal qualitative approach to say, let's not harvest. We know that there's a good level of die-off for like 4 days if we don't harvest 4 days prior to harvest. So that's a pretty good basis to evaluate what your procedures off of. Like a 4-day would be a good significant window there. Certainly a quantitative approach would give you more specifics to your specific situation. So with the assessment, what they also ask you to do is if you have any significant environmental changes, you would want to reassess what your plan was at the beginning of the year. So you do it at the top of the year, but anytime there's a big change in the water system, how you're using the water. Maybe mid-year you decide that one field you want to switch from overhead irrigation to a drip irrigation. You would note that in your assessment plan that you made that change. Any crop characteristics, maybe there's a pest issue that you're dealing with, that you're noticing quality concerns that could cause more damage to the crop, therefore more risk of pathogen infiltration. That could be something you note. Unfortunately, this area is prone to flooding issues. So if there was a big flooding event, that would be something you would want to note as well, documentation of that. That just gives you further evidence and liability if there was something to go wrong. And then anything else generally. So you evaluate, impact those changes, write down what it was and how you responded to that. Certainly, this would be a point where you could reach out to us, reach out to Extension as well, to help think through what the level of risk here is and what are good options. So all of this, anyone you have been through a Produce Safety Alliance training, there is always a record piece component to all of this. So here's a little bit about what you would be expected to track. So depends on your practices, of course, what kind of water you're using. So that inspection that I talked about at the beginning, that should inform that ag water assessment. They can go hand in hand. So both of those need to be documented. If you are doing any testing, if you've already got test results from being required to do that with GAP, for example, you would want to have the proper records with that, have the details about what the test results said, what was the quantitative number of amount of generic E. coli. That's typically the marker that we commonly see. If there's something else that you're testing for, certainly that could be used as evidence as well. Anything else that's being used to support how frequently you're testing, where you're testing. And then analytical methods used. So if you haven't done testing before, or if you want us to look at what test records you do have, just to confirm that it kind of meets some of the things that we're looking for. FDA does have a fact sheet on the types of lab methods that they approve as being a high quality standard in terms of the level of method approach. So there's a listing of different options that I could provide to you, the ones that they think are a good scientific method that you could take to your lab to confirm, okay, which of these do you provide and which would be best for my situation? We could help you work through those. And then if you do have a municipal water source, I would talk to your city at least annually to get a certificate of conformance to show that they are following their own rules that govern them, whether that's EPA or other county standards, to show that they're providing a potable water source to you. And then anything pertaining to the ag water assessment, any measures that you're taking if you determine that there is a concern with the water source, anything that you do to respond to that, you would want to track. So with that, I'm actually going to give Evan, our inspector for this region, for any of you that are on the west side. He is your inspector, and just want to give him an opportunity to talk a little bit about what the inspection looks like. Also to make a friendly face here for that, because we do try to be supportive, particularly with your first inspection, to help you work through this process and for it not to be so overwhelming and scary.
Hi, everyone. So I know I had a brief introduction at the beginning of the presentation and just now, but my name's Evan Lowe. I'm the Western Washington Inspector for the WSDA Produce Safety Program. I handle the whole west side of the state and any other place they send me to go. We're divided by region, but with all the size of our team and the reach of all the farms in different parts of the state. We kind of go wherever. But I'm here with Karen and Leah, like they said, to put a friendly face. And if you are doing an initial routine inspection, then you're able to meet me beforehand and ask any questions that you need to. Here on the slide, we have outlined the enforcement dates for our pre-harvest, our harvest, and post-harvest water uses. As you can see, the harvest, post-harvest water uses are already in compliance for businesses over 500,000, small businesses which are between 250 and 500,000, and small businesses, very small businesses that are 20 between 250,000 and 25,000. All those have been in compliance since January 26, 2024, but pre-harvest is coming up next year and 2026 and 2027. And there's different dates for sprout operations, but they don't apply to our covered produce.
So basically, you should be complying with the pre-harvest water requirements already. And this coming year for the large businesses, we'll be starting to enforce those pre-harvest water expectations, but we are lenient in the first year of your inspection with these new rules. So, and those business sizes are based on produce sales. So just know that when you think about your compliance dates relative to that chart.
And this slide, I'm just going to go over what a typical inspection looks like. I know that a lot of the operations out here are gap audited. Most operations in Washington State have to go through some type of gap audit at this point. Up here, I see a lot of harmonized gap. On the east side, there's a lot of global gap, SQF, packing houses. Sometimes we'll have Primus, but the harmonized gap 2.0, I believe, is the one I've seen at a lot of berry operations. It's going to be in person on farm during a covered activity. So you're growing, harvesting, packing, and holding. Technically, growing is a covered activity, but we don't do growing inspections as of right now. When we're walking through the farm, we'll observe your workers, make sure their health, hygiene, and training has properly been implemented. If you are using biological soil amendments of animal origin, so whether it's treated or untreated, your animal manures, your chicken meal, that they're being properly applied and you have the documentation to support that. If there are issues with wildlife and you have domesticated animals on the farm, or there's adjacent land use possibilities for cross-contamination, we go over those and make sure that if there is a chance for contamination, that you're taking the proper mitigation measures. Everything we covered, Karen covered with agricultural water, the proper documentation, testing, depending on what water source you're using, whether it be surface, ground, or municipal water. We go through your buildings and facilities, whether it's packing line or storage facility, cold storage rooms. Make sure your toilet and hand washing facilities are being properly maintained and monitored. Your post-harvest handling practices, and that you're properly cleaning and sanitizing on your equipment or in your packing lines. I'll go over later the distinction between cleaning and sanitizing, but that's one of the main things we're looking for. And records review. So all of the documentation of mitigation measures, all of your worker training, all of cleaning and sanitizing of equipment is what we're looking for on an inspection. And then we go through the exit interview, discuss any observations that we do find on the inspection, and then go forward with the result. Some of the common compliance issues that I see when I'm on inspections are the absence of a supervisor or responsible party attending the PSA grower training that was mentioned before. The PSA grower training right now is put on by the Produce Safety Alliance and is the only verified food safety training for the FDA in relation to the produce safety rule. So a supervisor or responsible party has to attend that training while they're on farm. Worker training, missing required topics. So people will have records of their worker trainings with the proper signatures and proper review, proper date, but they'll be missing certain topics regarding health and hygiene or proper maintenance on the farm for equipment, and missing those topics are some of the main things we see. I mentioned supervisor review and signature. By far, that's the most popular one, or the most frequent one I see, where they'll have just a signature at the bottom of the record or just the date, but you need to have a review that it was completed, a signature to verify that, and the date it was completed. And another thing we see is hand washing stations draining on the ground, especially in harvest areas. So we want to make sure that there's something to catch the wastewater or gray water if you do have a hand washing station near an area that covered activities are taking place. And this will go into a little bit more specifics, especially with berry operations, how to protect the harvested berries from contamination. So we see a lot of stacking of dirty bins, especially ones that make contact with food contact surfaces. So those on the moving harvesters or in the packing line, we want to make sure that if we are stacking bins, that there's a buffer, or we're making sure that they aren't contaminated on the bottom while you're stacking them so that it contaminates the produce under it. Cross-contamination through adjacent land, something that Karen went over. So if there's livestock operations near you, or you have domesticated animals on the farm or working animals, making sure that they aren't a source of contamination through adjacent land uses is part of your harvest assessment. Making sure we're doing the proper health and hygiene training for our workers, and post-harvest handling for equipment, especially ones that contact covered produce or food contact surfaces. So if we're using equipment for different tasks on the farm, making sure that they're being properly cleaned and sanitized before we use them for other tasks, or if workers are taking part in another task on other parts of the operation, that we're using the proper health and hygiene, hand washing practices before we're going to our covered activities. Cleaning and sanitizing equipment. So making sure we have routine cleaning and maintenance for harvest equipment and post-harvest equipment, and the difference between cleaning and sanitizing. So that's something I run into quite a lot, where people believe that pressure washing and just pressure washing with hot water is enough for their harvesters or their bins or different parts of the different food contact surfaces. But cleaning is the physical removal of debris or dirt, usually using a cleaning agent and water, and sanitizing is the next step, which is disinfecting and using a sanitizing agent on those food contact surfaces. So you need to do both if you're going to do one. You need to clean before you sanitize, and you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. One of the main things that I run into is the argument for the pressure washer, especially for the blueberry harvesters or berry harvesters. We were having an issue with harvesters being leased and not being properly cleaned and sanitized, and that being a potential route of contamination for E. coli. We want to make sure that if we are when we are, as necessary and appropriate, cleaning and sanitizing our harvest post-harvest equipment, that we're taking the proper steps to do so. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. Just wanted to finish with a couple of resources. One thing that's available online is this Ag Water Assessment Builder from FDA. So if you wanted to work through all the questions and things that we did already today, they do have this tool that walks you through the thought process. So that's one thing that's available. Please come see our smiling faces at our table. We've got great posters that you can use for training your workers. This is all the content. Remember, Evan was saying, we show that you do training, but we don't know what you train on. Well, in these posters, the content that we need to see that you're training on are in them, actually, and we have this in Spanish and English. If you need to know where to go to find a test lab, let us know. We can help you. We've also got this great online resource for cleaning and sanitizing. If you need to reinforce these concepts with your farm workers or anyone that's responsible for this activity, and you need more training for them, this is a great online module tool. I can help connect you to this, also available in Spanish and English. And then if you haven't been to a PSA training, or someone that you, one of your employees hasn't yet, we do have upcoming trainings happening in Linden in March. You should go. It's going to be great. We also have one in Linwood this year, which is kind of a new location for us. And then also on the east side. So come check that out. If you've already been through the PSA training, your certificate for attending that training doesn't expire. Of course, rules and information and evolving science always will be continuing. So the new module is present in these PSA trainings. But if you've already been through the whole training and you only want to get the content about the new rule, the Produce Safety Alliance is putting on virtual webinars on just that module specifically. As you can see, I've already used a lot of this. I've used some of their slides from that content. So you've gotten the bulk of that already by coming and attending this. So you actually have received a lot of that content. But if you want to get a nice certificate of completion that goes with that and hear from other great presenters, their perspective and pitch on that, great. There's also going to be a berry industry training just for you guys on cleaning and sanitizing. The commissions, berry commissions are involved, WSU, WSDA, that's happening March 11th. You can go to the commission, Raspberry Commission booth, and they have a sign-up sheet if you want to make sure you get notification about that. Happy to take questions. We could also transition. We've got Claire Murphy, who is one of our new extension folks from WSU, who's going to have a little information about herself and all the great research she's doing. We're really, really happy from WSDA's perspective to y'all. We're really happy that she's here in the state providing additional resources for you guys. Should we take a question, or we want to transition to that? Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Doesn't seem so.